cameras are rolling.
Rolling. Sound speeding.
The time has come for our celebration of cinema's classic, Real Monsters!
Hello, everyone. I bid you welcome to episode 6 of Real Monsters Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Danna, and I'm grateful you're tuning in. Thanks for joining me today. I'd like to start by wishing all of you a happy Frankenstein Day, celebrated August 30th to coincide with Mary Shelley's birthday. On today's episode, you'll be hearing from two modern horror storytellers on the subject of bringing classic monsters into modern media. But before then, I have an update on last episode's guests. Some of you may recall Dacre Stoker and Dr. Chris McCauley were running a Kickstarter for Dracula, The Return, Cult of the White Worm. Although the Kickstarter was unfortunately not successfully funded, they did successfully fund the project on Zoop shortly thereafter. So be on the lookout for Dracula, The Return, Cult of the White Worm very soon. Now, I recently attended a show which featured not only Dracula, but also Frankenstein's monster, the Bride of Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, the Wolf Man, and the Mummy. My guests on today's episode can talk all about it and the process behind bringing these stories to the stage. But first, as some of you might know, I secretly invite each of my Real Monsters podcast guests to begin their interview with their best cheesy mad scientist laugh to keep the fun Halloween and horror vibe alive. So, without further ado, please welcome to Real Monsters podcast, Andy Shultz and Heather Lehigh. Excellent. Oh my goodness, such a fantastic mad scientist laughs. Thank you, Andy and Heather. And it's of course very fitting because you are both some of the mad brains behind a show called Monstrosity, recently produced by Worst Ever Productions in Studio City, California. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us about your involvement with the show.
Yeah, hi, I'm Andy Shultz. I am the producer of Monstrosity and the producer of Worst Ever Productions and artistic director.
Heather Lehigh. I am associate producer of Worst Ever Productions and co-producer of Monstrosity.
Fantastic. Well, I really enjoyed this show. I know a couple of the performers who were in the show, and I have to say that Monstrosity by Worst Ever Productions is one of my favorite expanded universe classic monster tributes that I've seen because you managed to do something very specific with these characters and with this story, and that's that you managed to also make the human characters just as endearing and as fascinating as the monsters we know and love. So before I get into the details about that, Andy, tell me a little bit about the Monstrosity show for our listeners who might not be familiar with what that is and how you originally conceived the idea to present this tribute for live audiences.
First of all, thank you very much. Really appreciate all that. It's a tribute to the classic Universal monster movies. There's 6 pieces. Each piece is about 10 to 12 minutes in length. It's inspired by a different Universal monster, the Invisible Man, Wolfman, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula, Mummy, and Frankenstein's monster. Within it, we say it kind of a narrative set during World War II in this one forgotten German village. It's like kind of like so far off the grid that there's a world war, but the war really hasn't reached it. But now the soldiers are slowly coming together and they're finding that this small village has not just war problems, but monster problems with it, as well. I've been a big fan of the Universal monster movies since I was a little kid, and over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been really itching to do a project with those monsters. And finally, in 2019, we started discussing the project. And if you saw Monstrosity recently, we kind of been telling you it's a project that we've been working on for almost 3 years. That is 100% true because the intent was to have the show go up in 2020. But as you know, the world kind of shut down and a lot of different things kept happening and kept postponing the show. But it really started in 2019. And there's a group of writers getting together. Heather was there, Mike Nolan, Anna Ergine, Kelly Bianchi, Mia Gear, and we all kind of started talking about it. And everybody kind of started picking monsters, and we kind of just went from there with it.
So, Heather, you've also been there since the inception of this project.
I think I'm going to kind of predate that, where Andy, again, has this passion for Universal and Hammer Monsters, and you could tell this was brewing. And I believe it was probably at a wrap-up dining session of Christmas After Dark, and he was talking, hey, I'm thinking about doing it. And truly, I've never written a stage piece before, and I'm like, I have Bride. I have to get the Bride. And I didn't know how I was going to write it, but I knew I had to do Bride. So that was about December 2019. As things shut down, we were lucky enough to where we were in the writing stages where we could continue writing over Zoom and do table reads over Zoom, because we did go separate ways. Andy said, okay, it's World War II. You have to have a soldier, have to have a monster. Here's the setting, go. And so when we came back to do a table read via Zoom, we realized, wow, like I did Bride, but the Frankenstein was very different story, but we all kind of discussed it and like, where can we tether this together? Where can we have maybe our soldiers that got separated from each other? Where can we have a story, kind of thread? And, oh, I didn't realize Dr. Frankenstein disappeared, so I'll throw that into mine. And so it was really fun doing the table reads. We still had autonomy in the show, but yet still find threads to pull it together for the audience.
Yeah, and that was something we really wanted to do. And I mean, it was kind of cool how naturally it happened. We started talking like, well, wait a minute, what if these guys are in the same squad together or same regiment? And it just started working really nicely.
Captain Francis, wink, wink, Frank, he was separated from his privates who are mentioned in other stories. So there's little subtle thread throughs. My show, I end the first act with a plane crashing into a wall, and a plane is there on stage.
And that was a big thing. Heather and I realized at the same time, oh, your piece ends with a plane crash and Dracula starts with one. What if it's the exact same plane crash?
We made sure it had the right night witches insignia on the plane and everything. So it ends with the plane, act 1. It starts with the plane, act 2 with the crash. So there was little threads like that throughout the show.
So one of the cool things was the sound effects, if you hear, are very similar. We used almost the exact same sound effects to end her piece that mine begins with during the intermission. Though you guys are hearing in her piece more of what's happening on the ground, whereas Dracula's piece has more of the air battle with it.
Fantastic. A great way to really bring it into different perspectives to tell each of these stories. And while we're on the topic of perspectives and telling these stories, I'm curious, Heather, what it was that drew you to The Bride of Frankenstein. Of course, a fantastic character with so much potential for interesting stories. I am somewhat familiar with that. I was part of the Bride of Frankenstein Lives attraction at Universal Studios Hollywood during Halloween Horror Nights 2021. And I always love seeing new interpretations of this character. What was it that drew you to that classic story to put your own spin on it?
Well, in high school, I was a thespian. Our group, we kind of got little nicknames, long story short, and Bride of Frankenstein, and we named her Vambushka. And, we had, the mummy and the vamp and everything. And so Bride of Frankenstein has always been very near and dear and protective since high school. We had shirts and everything made up. So when this was coming on years later, and like I said, I never even wrote, but I'm like, nobody else I would want to write for the Bride. I want to. And then when we went back to, oh, this is really real, and I revisited the film in a new perspective, which I would never think I would get. But when I did, she's at the end, like the last 6-7 minutes. She's just this image that is just so near and dear to so many people. But then you realize she never speaks. We know nothing of her. Like, we've owned her without knowing her. And I mean, I knew how short her time is in the piece. But when I realized, wait a minute, because she's scared of the monster, he condemns her under the castle, she's, to die. And I literally, and Andy will say, because I say this all the time, like, oh my gosh, #me too. That's like, girls saying no, thank you. And like, oh, then, all this derogatory stuff comes on. I was like, oh my gosh, I want to give her a voice. We all assume we know who she is. We never even know her. So that was my whole goal with the Bride, was I want to give her a voice. Well, let's get to know her. Let's have her talk as much as she can. Who is she? And she's probably a very good, kind person that she was condemned because she just rejected out of fear this monster for the first seconds of her life. So that's why in the piece I wrote where, she's attached to Dr. Frankenstein, he shows her how to be a nurse and how to sew and do surgery. And she's very safe with him because in the movie, she does feel safe with him. And then I wanted to give her, how about she get to choose who she wants to be with? And I made the most romantic Captain America, Rhett Butler, because I wanted her to win because she lost so tragically without a voice. And so, yeah, that really drew me to her. So it was really hard to write the ending of that piece. And Andy had to give me a little tap on the shoulder. I'm like, I want her to have that happy ending. She deserves it. And he's like, no. I'm like, oh, you're right. And so she finds love, and it's true love. And she gets over her fears of the bad boyfriend she used to have in the past. There's a lot of Easter eggs I wrote in there. And so it was really hard, because then when she died, I'm like, oh, but the hero's he's such a good guy. And I'm like, no, he's got to go too. Because you know what? She gets her happy ending in the afterlife. So that's why it's such a tragic ending, but it's still such this healing moment for her. And I love the fact that here's this romantic couple that you're rooting for, and they perish under Rebel. It's like, okay, here's an intermission. Have a good time.
First of all, Heather was so passionate about it, and so were the writers. None of the writers had to fight over their monsters. Like, every writer was just naturally drawn to a certain monster, and they just went with it. Mike said Invisible Man and Dracula. Myself, love the Wolfman. That's where we all went. And so, but especially with Heather's piece, what I like about her piece is it's about the monster, but it's not about the monster attacking human. It's about humanity at that point. And but it was also showing the realization of war, and that was something different, and I think brought a nice balance to our show. So, and just Heather blew us away with that piece.
Yeah, I was a little nervous making a drama in the middle of all these monster genre stories, because I was like, oh my gosh, the pacing could be really slow because it's so dramatic. So we really tried hard to keep that pacing tight and entertaining. And just for a side note, I have the only human survivor of my monster might have perished, but we have a surviving female with Nurse Elsa.
Teresa Ireland, who played Nurse Elsie, only survivor of the entire show.
I also like that point you made there about a story about humanity, how the human characters and the human conflicts of war have come into play here. Maybe Andy or Heather, you can clarify this, but there was also a monologue at the end of the show from the sort of narrator, homaging the opening of Frankenstein, talking a little bit about the themes and lessons of the story and the horrors you had to experience. The ending monologue is something along the lines of the monster in human hearts, like the monster can be anybody, correct?
Yes, 100%.
So now that we know some of the themes and characters featured in the show, I would be very curious to hear, in your words, a breakdown of the 6 stories featured in the show.
Well, here's the first thing I want to say is what I like about all 6 pieces is that they're all different. No 2 plays are exactly the same. And we kick Act 1 off with the Invisible Man story, which was written by Mike Nolan, directed by Kate Grieco. And it's what I love about it is it's not so much horror as this is classic noir. It is literally that classic World War II secret agents or spies meeting up at the town to get information about the invisibility formula. And they're waiting for another guy to show up, who does eventually show up after from bandages. And you think it's Griffin, Invisible Man, but it's a gentleman named Marcel. And it's literally like, who trusts who, or who can't be trusted. And they go back and forth with it. The Invisible Man's watching the entire time. Thankfully, we had an amazing tech crew who was able to make props float on stage. So that way you guys see, the Invisible Man was there the entire time. And we had a great voiceover by Jerry Donahue, who has a really good voice. So in my opinion, so reminiscent of Claude Rains.
And I really love that twist because it definitely called to mind the ending of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, my favorite Universal monster film.
Oh, God, it was so much fun. And bravo to them for that one.
The second story also featured a similar twist, which turned the classic story on its head. Tell us about that.
I'm a huge, huge fan of The Wolfman, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that throughout the night. The story is about a soldier who basically is falling in love with this village girl, but the village girl is very torn because her brother was just murdered, and her family has these secrets, and they're carrying this burden of the secret. And it turns out the soldier was bit by a wolf, and the soldier's name is Talbot. Little Easter egg right there. As the night's progressing, the moon's coming out, you hear the wolf, and it turns out that he's not turning into the wolf, but she is, because it turns out that the village, her and her mother are both werewolves, and the wolf that Talbot apparently killed the night before and was bit by was her brother. But I really like this whole idea of, I really wanted to play a twist on the audience. Anybody who's familiar with the Wolfman knows Larry Talbot's the Wolfman, but just to find out that no, it's actually the villagers was a twist I really wanted to do.
Yeah, I think Andy and I really like twist a lot because even like with Vambushka, she's scared, she says no to the engagement, and then she says yes, and like, yay, happy ending, and you think that's the end, and then here comes the plane crash and the rock falls. So we do like to, sorry audience, keep you keep you guessing to the very end.
And that's part of what makes fresh stories so exciting, is because you are taking something familiar in these beloved characters and then oftentimes turning them on their head and twisting the knife, so to speak, to remind audiences this is something new. This is not quite what you were expecting. And it worked beautifully. So the final piece of Act 1 is the Fantastic Bride piece, which essentially leads directly into the Dracula piece, which opens Act 2.
Yes, and that was written by Anne Ergine, who, if you've ever seen any other plays by Anne, she writes really dark and twisted stuff, but she was very inspired by both the original Bela Lugosi Dracula as well as Christopher Lee's Hammer Dracula. Brett Gustafson, who I adore and I've worked with many times, he, from the very beginning, we always knew was going to be Dracula. Even all the way back in 2019, when we started talking about it, the first thing I told Anne was like, when we start doing the table read, we need to have Brett read. And every time we did a table read for it, it was Brett who was always Dracula. And when we finally got the show up and running, I didn't even hold my auditions for Dracula. I immediately called Brett. Said, Brett, so that guy who's been working on that project for a couple of years. You've read it several times. He goes, yeah. You'll be Dracula. Okay. And that was, he knew, because he knew the story and everything, and it was just a natural fit, and it was just wonderful. But the story behind this particular one was that a Russian night witch plane crashes. The pilot encounters a nurse who's trying to help her wounds, but it turns out that the nurse is actually one of the brides of Dracula, and she's supposed to bring this pilot to Dracula because Dracula's looking for a new bride. It's an emotional struggle for both the young lady who's played by Ryan Carlson, who's been bit halfway through the play by Dracula. It's just her dealing with losing her humanity and becoming a creature of the night versus what she's been. And so it's this great struggle because she's also struggling with the war as well. Part of her loves the idea of the war because it lets her be a pilot and be free up in the sky. But at the same time, she hates the war because it's taken her from her family. Wonderfully casted with Brett and Rayanne in that one, as well as Gabby Feingold, who plays the Anne Marie, who's the bride of Dracula. The next one was a piece based off of The Mummy called Do Not Consume. It was written by Mia Gear and directed by Jennifer Chun. It's basically played off this old Egyptian, not Egyptian myth, but story that was just true, that during, it was very common in the late 19th century and early 20th century. A lot of people were digging up mummies, and I apologize, this sounds gross. They were taking the bones and grinding them down to eat them, hoping to absorb energy and power. And it's kind of based off of that myth as well. But it was these two German soldiers who were basically trying to take a mummy and bring it back to the Fuhrer. But the mummy actually comes back to life during the scene. And it's a very interesting piece. And what was really cool about it was Jenny decided she wanted to tell it with flashlights. So we turned the main house lights down very, very low. So it's a little bit of a blue light, but most of it's all done with all the lighting otherwise is done with the actors holding flashlights.
And that was a very effective creative decision, by the way. The shadows cast upon the walls in that scene were so perfect for the mood.
Oh, it was so much fun watching that. And because literally we had a rehearsal on one side, loved the rehearsal, and Jane goes, well, how do you feel about me doing it with flashlights? I'm like, ooh, that would be really cool. Especially you got Richard Large, who played the mummy. He has that big, deep, commanding voice. Just loved it. So bravo to them. And then the last piece of the night was based off of the Monster and Frankenstein. And essentially it's at the trial of Dr. Frankenstein basically trying to be a god and made man. And there's a soldier named Bachman who's basically trying to find his unit. And he stumbles across this basically a religious zealot who's there to execute both Dr. Frankenstein and his monster. It's a struggle of who's right and who's wrong in this case. Is Dr. Frankenstein guilty, or should he be set free? Is it a crime for this creature to live? And does this religious leader have the right to be that judge and executioner in this case?
Well, these were thoroughly thought-provoking pieces, something that'll definitely satisfy a storytelling appetite beyond just seeing monsters. And don't get me wrong, obviously, we love monsters and we love seeing monsters in any environment, but particularly in a show like this, where the thought-provoking questions that are posed by each of the pieces and the monster's existence and interactions with these characters really made for a very complete production, and I was very pleased and, of course, thoroughly deep in thought after the show as well. Now, there was one thing that listeners may have noticed going through all 6 of these pieces, something that I was very happy to see: a lot of female representation in these stories, whether it be female monsters like the female werewolves, the Brides of Dracula, the Bride of Frankenstein, but also just female characters in general, the pilot and others. So I would love to hear from your perspectives the importance of female representation, both on stage and behind the scenes, in not only horror and classic monster media, but storytelling in general.
I have to give so much credit to Andy. Andy is very self-aware to include female writers, female directors, female characters. He's constantly striving to create equity in the arts. And he's inspired me, to be more aware of like, oh yeah, you're right. There isn't a lot of us around. And he really goes out of his way. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much respect for Andy and what he's created at Worst Ever Productions. So with Monstrosity, I just, there's so much with Andy supporting the characters, but really writers and directors as well. Andy, you really you go out of your way to speak up on behalf of women being involved in your shows. Is there something that from your male perspective, I'm just kind of curious as a female, that you see that?
It goes back to, I mean, it's not just here, you see it everywhere. It's just how many, we are in a I don't want to live in a male dominated world, but how many times have you seen a show where it's written, directed by men, or you have multi-writers and directors there? How many of them are men? There isn't a lot of equal representation in the past I've seen. And one thing I've really strived for with Sort of Productions is I want to have as much equal balance of everything, whether it's men, women, transgender, different, gender identities, different religions, different groups. I want everybody counts, everybody matters. And that's something I've taken great pride with. We have everybody, it's like the beginning of an Assassin's Creed game. This show was brought together by a different group of people with different beliefs and lifestyles. And that's something I take such great pride in. And especially with Monstrosity, here's what's really cool. I didn't want all the female characters to be like, Evelyn Ankers in Wolfman, which is just like, oh, I'm the girl who's going to sit here, who's going to fall in love with the monster, or the guy who's going to kill the monster. I didn't want that. I wanted the women to actually have voices. So, like with the piece I wrote, I wanted her to be one of the main characters. And what I love about the bride, Bambushka, is how important she is. Where it's not just like in the original Bride of Frankenstein. She's only on there for a few minutes and doesn't have a voice. I love the fact that Heather brought that to life and gave her such wonderful characters. Same thing with Nurse Elsie. I love, Ulia, who's in the Invisible Man, and then just all these different characters. We have so many female characters who aren't just an afterthought or just to be there to be eye candy. I wanted these characters, and they brought them to life, and the writers just naturally did that. Because I just said, guy, because when you have, as a guy, it's always so much easier to write a male character than it is a female character. For me, it is, and that's something I struggled with early on as a younger writer. As I got older and I got, and I've had more time to harness my skills, I go out of my way. I really want to have strong female characters, and that's what I love about the shows. We got them. And also, I want to point this out. Monstrosity had, out of the 6 pieces, 4 of the pieces were directed by women. 3 of them were written by women.
I had no idea I was going to feel like #MeToo watching that Bride of Frankenstein again, but with this time. And so giving her that voice, that's what I was saying, finding that middle ground. She's not this sexy cutie one, and she's not this scary monster. You get to know her, the humanity of her within the monster. And I really take a lot of pride in that middle ground for her.
Very well said. So throughout the 6 stories, there were more than a few tongue-in-cheek Easter eggs and references specifically for classic monster aficionados to catch. But I'm curious to hear from you what some of your favorite hidden details and Easter eggs were throughout the show.
For me, it's definitely in Wolfman. I purposely named the main character Leonidas Talbot, which is not Larry Talbot as the normal character would be, but Talbot's the last name of the Wolfman in the original movie. But Leonidas is the full long name of Lon Chaney. His real name was Leonidas, or his dad's name was at least. And we make reference at one point in the play. Talbot's talking about his dad. He goes, "Yeah, he wasn't around much as a kid. It was a phantom." A reference to Lon Chaney Jr.'s dad being Lon Chaney Sr., the original Phantom of the Opera.
I laughed out loud in the theater at that line.
See, it was so funny. Not every audience got that joke. Some audiences did. I sit in the lobby sometimes during the show, and I'll sit there and I'll listen because you can hear the cast, and I wait for certain lines or whatnot, and so some nights, yes, that would get a good chuckle out of the audience, but sometimes they missed it. And I'm like, ah.
Oh yes, the name play in this production was so strong. I even caught which writer integrated Daninsky because that was pretty good.
Yep.
Yeah, you rarely ever hear the Paul Naschy films referenced in the same vein as Universal and Hammer, so I appreciated that. Now, Heather, there is one particular element of the show that you also contributed that every single audience member would see during every show, and you worked very hard on it, and I have to say, it looked really good. Would you like to tell us more about it?
I would. I'm very proud. Unbeknownst to me, when we were sure we can do this over the summer, I ended up creating the set, designing and creating the set pieces. And my dad made the frame, and I spent a summer teaching myself how to make a stone wall from styrofoam. We wanted to have a visual where the wall collapsed on them. So we actually have the flat that folds back, and a quarter of the wall disappears in this blackout. When you're hearing this plane crashing, when the lights come on, you're missing a quarter of the wall, and you have a pile of stone laid out upon Vambushka and Jasper. That was a bigger task than I thought. And Andy he's a brilliant writer. He's an artist. He's a supporter, nurturer, and director, but he does not do sets. So he did not know why I was like, we got to start the set. Who's going to do the set? How are we going to do the set? And Andy and I were a good team together. And it's like, well, if no one's doing it, I guess I will. So that was a big accomplishment. I'm very proud of the folding wall.
And Heather is the most supportive person on earth. She'll come to one of my rehearsals to help out, and just to like make sure, just to give another perspective. And so while she's there watching it, she's sitting there either shaving down rocks again, or she's sewing them together. So she'll have this netting she has made where she's putting the rocks onto it, so that way it can be laid across the actors, look like debris laying on them. And so she's literally every moment where she wasn't asleep or teaching, she was working on these set pieces. So I mean, I can't thank her enough for her commitment to the show. And I don't say this enough about Monstrosity. This was a passion project that Heather really did help bring to life for me, and I thank her very much for it. I would love to give a big shout out to everybody who were part of Monstrosity. We had a great cast for it, especially who did their makeup. Rachel Becker, who did her own makeup, Staggerly Cole, Teresa Ireland. We also had Ulia, Sean, and Rizzy and Ryan from Invisible Man. Wolfman had Deja, Kate, and Simon. Your cast from who I just mentioned from Bride. Dracula had Gabby, Brett, and Rayanne. The Mummy cast: Richard Large, Ron Gavalden, KB Delude, and then just our awesome cast from Frankenstein, which was the Lancaster, Hudson, Cameron, and Jeremy. We had such a great cast. So everybody in that show worked really hard. So I want to give a big shout out to them. So thank you to our wonderful cast and our crew. We had Cara Valencia, Jonathan Garcia, and Vincent Miller, who were behind the scenes. And once again, I want to just thank Heather Lehigh. I caught COVID about a week before the show opened, and I missed tech and dress. So Heather took over and ran everything. I wasn't worried because I know Heather can do anything, and she did. She did an amazing job. And like I said, none of this is without Heather.
Well, bravo, Heather. I absolutely love hearing about the teamwork that makes the dream work, especially in theater. As somebody who also started in theater myself, there is really nothing like the teamwork that comes together to create something in an environment like this from scratch, whether it is a black box theater or a sheet of styrofoam. As you said, being able to bring something to life and tell these stories is really, really magical. And you transformed the space very nicely. So, Heather, we've heard a little bit about your early life and your introduction to the classic monsters, but I'm curious, Heather, and then we'll throw it to Andy. What were some of your earliest classic monster influences? Do you remember the first classic monster film you saw?
Oh gosh, I watched TV at such an early age. I would honestly, I really think it'd probably be Abbott and Costello meets the Mummy, and then my Adam's Family. I love the television show. Oh, I had a thing for Thing, but I just thought it was adorable. And that's the thing about monsters. Like then watching the werewolf and the creature from the Black. When I would watch it, it was already so accepted in my world because I saw it in different genres. I saw it, where it's, comedic and accepted. So it never scared me. I just knew I was watching a black and white fun, movie. So I think it was just a combination as a whirlwind of all those. But I think it was Abbott and Costello Mommy was the first one I recall.
Oh, and those Abbott and Costello monster films still hold up to this day. Not too long ago, I was at the New Beverly Cinema and they were screening Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And behind me, I had a couple of very young children and their families sitting in the row behind me. And at various points in the film, obviously they're laughing, they're enjoying it, did not appear to have seen the film before. And at one point, one of the kids turns to his mom and he goes, "This is the funniest movie ever." And
I love
it
it.
warmed my heart so much.
I think that's a great way to introduce young children, so they could ease into the actual classics. Yeah.
Yes, and those movies were so brilliantly balanced, in my opinion, because you're right. They balance the comedy and the horror in a way that, your kids probably won't have nightmares from it. But on the other hand, the monsters aren't played for comedy either. It's the contrast between, Bela Lugosi and the Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman playing their characters as usual, and then Abbott and Costello causing all sorts of comedic havoc. That's what creates the comedy, but it's not necessarily played for laughs, which makes it very true to the canon as well, in my opinion. I know that's a very heated debate among monster fans, and I plan to have a whole episode about that down the line. How about you, Andy?
Oh man, I was thinking about it, and I was probably about 3 or 4, and we're talking like this is like 87, 88, and I got up one night in the middle of the night, and I decided to go watch TV. So I couldn't sleep, and I turned on the TV. There was one of the late night monster movies on, and it was the Wolfman, and it was that scene, and I remember it because it's you had one of those scenes in the movie that just kind of sticks with you forever. And it's that first time you kind of see the Wolfman coming out from behind the tree, so you actually see the full makeup for the very first time on his face, and it just totally messed with me. I'm like, and so I thought for a while that the Wolfman was always outside my bedroom window as a little kid, and my dad was like, "Okay, time to fix this." So my dad had to sit down with me and explain that no, these are just movies. These are just actors who put on makeup, and at the end of the day, they go home and have dinner with their families. And so and he goes, "Let's watch another movie together." So what my dad decided to do is he just decided to go all out and put on Nightmare on Elm Street, and that was what we watched. That's my dad's way of curing something. He goes, "Oh, we'll just go to the extreme with it." So big difference between Wolfman from the 1940s versus Freddy Krueger in the 80s. Ever since then, I've always loved horror movies, and especially the classic Universal films. Last year for my birthday, I treated myself and I bought that giant Blu-ray box set that has like every single monster movie,
Yes.
which is neat 'cause I actually got to share with my niece, who at the time was 4. I showed her for the very first time last year, about this time last year, the Creature from the Black Lagoon. So that was her very first monster movie. Now, with everything you see on TV, nobody get phased, but she's sitting there watching it and she's just enthralled. And there's that scene in it where, the creature's kind of reaching over the boat. And you just see his hand, right? And you just saw her starting to like get scared, like her mouth was opening, like she was getting ready to scream. And then I saw that and I grabbed her and she just started laughing. These movies, especially when you're so young, are so impactful because I didn't rely on CGI. And don't get me wrong, I have no problem with blood or, you know, slasher movies or anything like that. These are just classic great monster movies, and they didn't need any of that. They just needed great acting and makeup. Just seeing a hand or just a monster come from around the tree is just so powerful that it makes such an impact on you that you end up spending, most of your adult life enjoying these movies.
Very well said. And I'm so glad that you were able to have this team and these resources to channel that energy into creating something. So, throughout that process of creating Monstrosity, I'm curious what you're most proud of.
For me, it's just that the fact the audience came in and enjoyed it and was able to enjoy something where it was not meant to be scary, like terrifying, but maybe a little scary and spooky and fun. And just to be part of that, legacy, just to be able to take these monsters that everybody knows and then just put a little bit of a twist on it, to me is just so fun and just so magical. And I'm very grateful that I got the opportunity to do it. And I hope people are inspired and just enjoy it. I hope they take away from the same thing. What the monsters do for me, they make me happy, and I hope they were made happy.
Heather, anything to add on that?
The fact that, we brought classic monsters into a modern day entertainment, hopefully like renewing interest and renewing the spark of having fun with the unknown and the terrors. But also, truly kind of circling back, I'm really super proud of empowering so much female characters, especially giving the Bride of Frankenstein, Vambushka, a voice, but so many other characters within our show to show strength and empowerment that those women are equal with the men within the show. And I'm proud of all the characters having a voice like that.
So these next couple of questions are just for fun, and if any of these venture into spoiler territory, you don't necessarily have to answer them, but I am curious to hear what you have to contribute to this. Those of you who've been listening to the show for a few episodes now might have heard that I also asked this question to Brian Nyford, who is the creator of Monsters the Forsaken, a comic book series that happens to take place in the World War II era as well. I am curious, Heather and Andy, what are some other time periods besides World War II that you would like to see the classic monsters run around in?
I'll be honest, I love Brian's answer. If I could circle back to that, I love that Jack the Ripper idea he had. But I told Andy I would love, maybe civil rights or I would some kind of mashup because I like events. Like put the monsters, thrown it in to like Forrest Gump. Those events, he did, Vietnam War, but he also did, the protests, and he also did these ping pong marathons. He did the shrimp boat. I'd love to put monsters, throw them into those kind of scenarios in the 60s and 70s.
Also perfect from a historical angle because the 1960s was such a huge time for monster kids and monster media. Mark Voger's book Monster Mash details just how important the monsters were to the 1960s pop culture landscape. So I'm totally with you on that one, Heather.
And the parallelism of civil rights movement with the monster's identity. Yeah, I'm all for it.
For me, I would actually really, really love to see keep it in the same time period, but make it noir in Hollywood, Los Angeles, or New York. I think that'd be interesting. Like, make it more of a mystery would be a lot of fun because we kind of talked about that. We talked about at one point we really need to see Monstrosity, but as like a noir type of thing. I'm obsessed with 1930s, 1940s. I'm a history major, and so that's something that always kind of like is in my mind. And just to like, it'd be interesting, the monsters meet Black Dahlia or something along those lines. But also, I think another great time period would be I would love to see them set during the Civil War. And what if half of them were in the South and half of them were in the North?
Well, it sounds to me like there might be a creeping need for a Monstrosity Volume 2.
Ooh. You never know. We have talked about building a well for the next, and by asking Heather in her backyard building a well. You never know because the creature from the Black Lagoon or the Phantom could show up.
Well, you know that I will be there filling a seat if that does happen. And in the meantime, I see that Worst Ever Productions does have a couple other productions coming up. Tell our audiences where they can see more about your company and what sort of stories they can expect to see on the stage very soon.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can definitely check us out on our website, worsteverprods.com, or follow us on social media at Worst Ever Prods, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. That's to get the most up-to-date information. But our upcoming shows is in about 2.5 weeks, is our Halloween Radio Spectacular. We call it a hybrid show. It's part radio show, part live stage play, but kind of set in the golden era of Hollywood and radio. So we have pieces set in everywhere from the early 1930s up through the early 50s. And they're all done on stage as a radio show. The actors are in costumes. They're all set during Halloween, but some of them are comedies, some of them are horror. And each piece is about 10 minutes. We did one of our pieces at Midsummer Scream, and it was just a lot of fun, called All Shook Up. It involves Elvis, but I'm not going to say much more than that.
And this is our third installment. We started on Zoom with Radio Spectacular, and then last year, our first show back to the real world was the second attempt. So this is kind of an annual show we put on to kick off the Halloween season.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun because it's a family-friendly show. It gives it kind of kicks off the Halloween season, as Heather says, but it's very family-friendly. So it's nice to be able to offer that kind of thing because there's so many other. And there's nothing wrong with them. We go to all the different haunts as well. You have some that some kids might find some of the other haunts or other theater events a little bit too extreme or just a little bit too scary for them. But this one's kind of fun because we have a small theater, and it's a lot of good time. We decorate. We put up regular Halloween decorations. Last year we put up some stuff and we were able to find some old vintage style reproductions. We put that up, and it's a fun show, and we do it for one weekend only, and it's a good time. It's like good old fun, old fashioned Halloween.
And next year, Andy's going to focus more on bringing back some of his full shows. And I think we were mentioning about Lonely at the Top. Andy, you want to?
Yeah. So 2023 is actually our fifth season. So we're very excited to celebrate 5 seasons of shows. And so we're going to be bringing back our actual very first show that Worcester Productions did, which is called Lonely at the Top, which is, I like to call it, it's a 1940s murder mystery musical comedy done as a radio show, but it's set in 1947. And it's a whodunit, but it's very much about female empowerment and has a very female heavy cast. And it's basically about, can a woman be a killer? And it's all time through slapstick and noir comedy. And it was actually Heather performed in the very first show, or the first production of it in 2019, and we're bringing it back for the 5th anniversary season.
Well, the future is bright for Worst Ever Productions, and I'm very happy to have gotten on board when I did. I look forward to seeing more of what you're doing, and I thank you so much for sharing your stories with the Real Monsters podcast listeners today. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was so much fun.
And with that, keep it real, Monster fans. I'm AJ Danna, and I'll catch you next time on the next episode of Real Monsters Podcast. Real Monsters Podcast theme song by Alexander Taylor. Real Monsters logo and key art by Will Davenport. Real Monsters Podcast is an unofficial fan tribute to the classic monster stories of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and is not sponsored by any of the entertainment entities discussed. Any and all opinions expressed within Real Monsters Podcast are those of my own or those of my guests. Stay tuned and subscribe to Real Monsters Podcast for even more monstrous discussions.